Progress and Poverty and Perspectives, chapters 22 and 23. And I guess the title pretty much tells you what I'm doing. I'm going to do all of chapter 22 and part of chapter 23, just up to the year 2000, basically. And then we're going to call it quits, and this is going to be your last lecture. So it may be just a little bit longer than normal, but like I say, this is the last one, so you can say hip hip hooray if you want to. Now, it's really hard to explain to someone who wasn't alive during the 1970s the feelings of the everyday American people. I mean, the normal everyday citizens. That great American middle class that Nixon talked about. We were all hurting over the Vietnam War. We were hurting over the civil rights movement and the violence and the assassinations of President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King and even Malcolm X. And then there were the gas shortages and the Iran hostage situation. It seemed like every time we turned around, something else was happening. Our prestige overseas was rock bottom. We didn't trust or even like our military very much. We were very disappointed in the tenure of President Carter. He was a good man. Perhaps he was too good and too religious to be president. Like I said, he was a disappointment. He did appoint numerous African Americans to political positions and then had them serve as ambassadors. But the black people wanted more. It seemed to them that President Carter was much more interested in balancing the budget and fighting inflation than advancing any black civil rights. But he did listen and always welcomed an African American delegation to the White House. But unemployment was very high, and yet at the same time there were more and more educated African Americans in well-paid jobs. But for the uneducated and the poor, there was an ever-increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots of the black race. And their feelings were the political appointments made by Carter just were not really important enough. So with this upcoming election in 1980, there was a new man, this crazy actor from California. Well, they were a little bit afraid of him. Not only was he a Republican, but they thought his ideas were just a bit too far to the right. So even though they were disillusioned with Carter, 90% of the black voters that voted for Carter. Better the devil you know, etc., etc. So how did Reagan win? Well, he won all the southern states except Georgia, which was Carter's home state. Now, President Reagan was born in Illinois, February 1911. And while he initially chose a career in entertainment, appearing in more than 50 films, and while he was in Hollywood, he also served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild, and he met his future wife, Nancy Davis. He served 2 terms as governor of California, and where he had originally been a liberal Democrat, he ran for the U.S. presidency as a conservative Republican and won 2 terms beginning in 1980. And in all honesty, the man looks presidential, and he talked a good talk. We needed someone who was to give us some prestige. He appealed to the white voters, even some Democrats, and there was even a massive amount of Democrats that voted Republican for the first time. His stance was he was against big government, and he wanted welfare reform because there was too many welfare queens. And at this time, there were several very highly publicized cases that were prosecuted, and it was just terrible. I mean, the girl would drive a Cadillac up to get her food stamps. And he was also against affirmative action. And before he was even sworn in as president, the announcement was made that there would be African American appointments in his new administration. And they would not be appointed to black positions, rather to non-black positions. Strange. There were some blacks that protested one black man's appointment, a man named William Bell. It seemed that Mr. William Bell of Michigan was being appointed to a job where he needed experience. He was going to be a minister of an agency that employed more than 3,000 people. And the most he had ever managed was 4, which is a very valid point. But the protests were listened to, and Mr. Bell's name was withdrawn for nomination, and before the dust had died down, there were even more problems. Reagan was trying to accomplish something with the Commission on Civil Rights. He was attempting to replace the current nonpartisan members with people who reflected his own views. And then there was a fervor raised. Another black man, Reverend B. Sam J. Hart. He was a black man, and they tried to appoint him to the Civil Rights Commission, but he was opposed to all civil rights. Anything to do with civil rights, he didn't like it. So both Bell and Hart's names were withdrawn. And basically, this Civil Rights Commission is becoming a mouthpiece for the administration. And with the weakening of the administration, well, it seems like the long-taught enforcement of discrimination laws is going to be curtailed. And it got to the point that there was even some who did not want to be nominated because there was kind of a stench to it, especially to the Commission on Civil Rights. He'd been a very strong advocate for justice and equality, and he had successfully gutted it. And as for the blacks in the Foreign Service, their numbers were drastically down. And it became very clear that to the black community that what they had taken for granted for so long was not going to happen anymore. But in the past, it didn't matter what the presidential policies had been, the recipients of support and respect from the black community was perceived. But now this commission is nothing more, like I said, than a mouthpiece. The president said, the enforcement of civil rights should be left to the state. Well, that did kind of go along with his campaign statement of wanting smaller government. But you can see that he's not doing anything to help the problem. He'd been very, very slow to renew the Voting Act in 1982. And it looked like now that the federal government was in the business of enforcing federal regulations, was not in the business of enforcing federal regulations on equality. And then there is a redistricting plan that took place. And usually when this is done, it's done at the behest of a political group to get their guy in the right district. But to make matters worse, there was a law that 11-year-old law that they couldn't grant tax-exempt status to any private school that had practiced racial discrimination. And there were two schools, one in North Carolina, one in South Carolina, that went to court over it. And it was close, but the policy was upheld, and it was kind of a blow for the administration. Julius Chambers of the NAACP legal counsel had argued that redistricting of any kind was unfair because it made it difficult for blacks to vote, and the lower courts upheld his view. Of course, the South Carolina appealed, won. The case goes to the Supreme Court, and lo and behold, they won. It's another blow for the presidency. Then there's new restrictions in eligibility for help and also a tax change. For instance, food stamps and child nutrition assistance, aid for the families with dependent children, and student grants for colleges. Now, for student loans, and I got caught in this one myself, if you earned $30,000 a year, you could not get a grant. In that year, my husband and I made $30,100. Now, we had 5 children in the home. And our daughter lost all her aid and had to drop out of college. And she joined the military to finish her education. And that, my dear friends, was the beginning of my anger with the Republicans. As for tax relief, if you made $15,000 a year or less, you got an 8% tax decrease. But if you made $50,000 or more, you got a 35% tax decrease. What's the reasoning behind this? Well, the theory is kind of basically a sound one. If a business does well, they expand and hire people who get paid, and then they spend money and stimulate the economy. And the more things you buy, the more things had to be made. So it looks good on paper. It's called the trickle-down effect. But no matter how you look at it or how you try to explain it, the lower class got less tax relief and less help from the government. And the appearance was beginning to be very obvious that the president didn't really give a hoot or have any regard for the lower class, regardless of color. He also was not very impressed with his plan to have a Martin Luther King holiday. He just kind of ignored it. And all of a sudden, the down in the world white supremacist Senator Jesse Helms began questioning MLK's communist associations. And what happens, turns around in South Carolina, Senator Strom Thurmond, who was also a racist, he supported the holiday. And all of a sudden, both houses passed the bill. And President Reagan made a very gala occasion with the signing. And you would have thought it was his idea from the very beginning. And here's a picture of him seeing it. As you can see, there's Bush one behind him and a lot of the black leaders. The black community is getting a little weary of the president's policies. Of course, the white community loved him, at least the upper and middle white class. In 1985, the unemployment percentages were very high. For the African-American community, it was 15.6%. But for the African-American youth, it was over 50%. The white was high also, but nothing compared to that. It was 6.6%. So the president really, he didn't understand the frustrations of the black community, and he hadn't helped, he'd hurt. And even with the growing class of middle-class blacks, their percentage was just not large enough to make any dent in the rapidly growing black underclass. So let's talk a little bit about Jesse Jackson. He began civil rights work while he was in college, and he graduated and he went to graduate school at the Chicago Theological Seminary. And while he was there, he got interested in civil rights, and he met Martin Luther King, so he left the seminary to go work with Martin Luther King. And he was even with him in Memphis when he was assassinated. But after the assassination, he leaves the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and formed his own organization called PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Later, he changed the name to People United to Serve Humanity, and he used the headquarters as Chicago was his headquarters. He became, I guess you'd say, the self-appointed black ambassador to the white business community. Self-appointed. Well, at least we got a black man working for black people, which was a step in the right direction. Because for far too many years, we'd had white people trying to lead, and they're not doing a very good job. But anyway, because of his work with the Coca-Cola Company, the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise, the Anheuser-Busch, 7-Up, and even Burger King, there began to be an expansion of black employment and franchises for the black. He then began to apply this same type of push, if you will, to go into politics. He kept reminding the African Americans of the political power they could have if they would just vote. He also reminded them of the few votes that Reagan had won by and a tremendous number of blacks that were not even registered to vote. In other words, he's saying, brother, you could have stopped this man. And it was his earnest desire to have the black community be strong enough to influence the 1984 election. And then he decides he's going to run for president himself. Benjamin Hooks, the NAACP director at the time, reminded him that if an overwhelming number of black voters are voting for a black man, then we've lost our voice in selecting the white candidate. And truer words have never been spoken. It's kind of like when a party splits. The combined parties may have the total percentage, but it can be the third party that takes the election. But Jackson was confident and made a serious run out of it. And it was actually comforting to see a man, an educated, informed black man among all those white candidates. But me old mom says, you know, if you lay down with dogs, you're going to get up with fleas. And apparently the adage held some truth, or at least to the whites and to some black voters. You see, Jackson had made a trip to the Middle East. And he met Yasser Arafat. And he told him that peace in the Middle East could be obtained without considering the Palestinians. And there is truth in that statement, but at that time, Arafat was considered a terrorist plotter and supporter by the United States. A little bit later, he manages to insult the large portion of the Jewish community in New York. Not to be daunted, he made another trip to Syria in December of 1983. And this one was an attempt to gain the release of a young black airman, Lieutenant Robert O. Goodman, Jr., whose plane had been shot down over Syria. Although some said it was not a reconnaissance mission, rather a bombing mission, he did not drop any bombs. Anyway, Jackson had not been given any kind of guarantee from Syria that he'd even be permitted to meet with the president and plead his case. But after a meeting and a 2-day wait, it was announced that the Syrian Foreign Ministry was going to release Goodman in response to Jackson's humane appeal and demands of the U.S. government. Of course, there was further statement that they also stated that they hoped the release would facilitate the withdrawal of American troops from Lebanon. Now, President Reagan had not returned any phone calls from Mr. Jackson, and the State Department had even contacted him and told him he shouldn't go. But with the release and return of Goodman, of course, the president received Jackson and Goodman both at the White House. Now, it has been reported that the president told Jackson the reason for his cold shoulder was that he wanted Syrian government to realize that this was not a government-sponsored trip. It's a private one. And if that was the case, there was a better chance of success, he said. Ha, ha, ha. In reality, it was a very shrewd move for the Syrians. It's kind of a win-win situation. When Jackson had publicly called for Goodman's release, they had contacted and even invited Jackson to come to Syria. If they released Goodman to Jackson, it would show the magnanimity of their country and embarrass the president. If they decided to hold on to him, well, the value of Goodman as a bargaining chip with Washington was going to go up. Now, your text menu really doesn't give you an awful lot of information, especially on the people who went. And this trip, there was 4 campaign aides, 21 Secret Servicemen, 5 American ministers, 2 of Jackson's teenage son. One of those ministers, by the way, was Louis Farrakhan, and of course himself. So there was a total of 33 in the party. Some thought this was a very bad idea, and even if he had gone, he should not have taken Mr. Farrakhan. So any hope Jackson had of healing the breach between the Jewish community and his campaign was now down the tubes. He made another trip in 1999 and obtained the release of 3 American soldiers that were being held prisoner in Yugoslavia. He also made several more trips, and he always seemed to obtain the release of the Americans. And they weren't always black, even though the majority of them were. Now, it was not to be, and although I admit I was very tempted to vote for him in the primary, because of all the Democratic candidates, I liked him best. But I kept thinking, if he got the nomination, would he live long enough to even make the election? But in the end, he lost the nomination to Walter Mondale, and the first woman ever nominated as vice presidential candidate, Geraldine Ferraro. But even with all black voters voting for Mondale, it was to be a repeat of the 1980 election. Too many white Democrats were voting Republican. And even though 89% of the black voters did vote Democratic, they were overwhelmingly outnumbered by the white voters. So we're going to have another 4 years of the Reagan policies. Have you ever heard of that word, quadridium? It is an unusual word I came across, and it just means a series of something lasting for 4 years. So we have the quadridium of Reagan. And then we got the president's election in 1988, and there is a total plethora of candidates. You got Dukakis, Hart, Gephardt, Gore, Babbitt, and Jesse Jackson. Wow. Well, Jackson, of course, didn't get the nomination. Dukakis did, and although he did win 7 primaries, and he had 92% of the black vote, and 17% of the white vote, but after failing for a second attempt to gain the nomination, he then decided he was going to concentrate on black voter registrations. As I said, George Dukakis wins the Democratic nod. Reagan's vice president, George Bush, got the Republican nod. Now, George Bush had some very impressive credentials. He had been a long career in public service, and he was going to be hard to beat. He'd been a U.S. representative. He had been the director of the CIA. He'd been director of the United States liaison officer in China. He was ambassador to the United Nations, and of course, he was the beloved Reagan's vice president. Now, he appeared to be very interested in the success and workings of the United Negro College Fund, but that stance he took on the Civil Rights Bill back in 1964, well, some people began to question his sincerity to racial equality. And it was not a nice race. Oh, I remember it. And the Republicans threw all the dirt they could come up with at the Democratic candidate. They claimed Dukakis was soft on crime. that he did not have the right patriotic feelings, and because he was, excuse me, because of his leading the state as governor, it had led to a decline in American prestige because of his allowing the permissive liberal elites to help him out. So I have never understood how one state's running could affect anything overseas, but some people will believe anything. Even though 90% of the black vote was for Democrats, Bush was swept into office. And I don't think it was so much because he was so well liked or so well known. It was because he was the beloved Reagan successor. And when he was questioned on why he did not campaign in the black communities, he answered, he had to work for votes in the suburbs and among those more likely to support him, especially in the middle and upper income elements of the cities. He did add that he would be president for all people. Actually, his supporters is going to be president for him. And no matter how you look at it, that could be construed as a racist remark. The blacks wouldn't support him, so why even bother going out there? The blacks weren't even worth courting. Ouch. So what about the economic state of our union? Now, for those of us in the lower income bracket, and having lived through that decade and raising children, teenage children, I'm a little bit more than familiar with this situation. There's always been a very wide disparity between the haves and the have-nots. But the stats are getting staggering, because most of the country's money is in the hands of the top 1%. And that top 1% is 95% white. And while the income, really high incomes of the upper echelon group, we had more millionaires than ever before by the end of the 1980s. Meanwhile, the income for the lower working class is dropping. It dropped from an average of $4,100 a year, $41,000 a year to $35,000 a year. Yes, it's only 10% of our population, but among that 10%, more than 50% was black. It's really sad when any portion of the population's income drops. But on the upside, well, there were 52 billionaires and 1.3 million millionaires by the end of the decade. I think in 2012, there were 9 million Americans that had a net worth of more than $1 million. Of course, there's none of them in my circle of friends. There's an irony about this, because even though the economy looked good and we had more millionaires than ever, it also looked good back in the 1920s. And if it wasn't for that wide disparity of distribution of wealth, or as a political scientist like to say, the uneven distribution of wealth, maybe it wouldn't have been as bad. But what's going on in the economy? Well, you've got a steady rise in unemployment. The savings and loan associations are failing and had to be bailed out. Our trade deficit is increasing. We've got plant closings, business failures, home foreclosures, and of course, the new home starts, which is a way of keeping track of our economy, was way down. So this economic bubble was showing signs of bursting. So what did Bush do for the African Americans to help? Well, there are two names that come to mind, Colin Powell and Louis Sullivan. Now, Colin Powell became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first African American ever. And Louis Sullivan became the outspoken Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. But there were no special programs to help any disadvantaged Americans, black or white. And his first veto was to veto the raising of the minimum wage. He vetoed a Civil Rights Act. Although his fellow Republicans did push it through again, and they overrode his veto, and he had to sign for it. He vetoed the motor voter bill. He vetoed a bill to extend unemployment rights during a time of very high unemployment. He vetoed the family leave bill. So what does this say about our sitting president? He was not for any type of progressive or social legislation. And the Supreme Court steps in. And as they like to say, they begin to stem the tide of the civil rights gains. For instance, they reversed a decision that set aside a certain number of programs for the minority contractors as being unconstitutional. So African Americans are feeling thwarted, if not altogether powerless, because the vetoing of the bills by the president, the Supreme Court reversing decisions. Wow. So it goes without saying that the black community was more than a bit surprised when the president actually nominated a black man to be a federal judge, Clarence Thomas. Yes, he had worked in the Department of Education as the director, as also director and chair of the Equal Opportunity Commission until 1990. He had qualifications. He was a lawyer, but there is a controversy. Like I said, he was on the conservative side, but the African American community was pleased that at last the president had done something they saw as positive. Thomas even got support from some traditionally racist Southern senators. And it began to look like that he could not be opposed simply because of the color of his skin. But let's spend a little bit of time on Mr. Thomas and just see what you think about him. He was first nominated for the Federal Court of Appeals in 1990, and a year later, the president appointed him to fill Thurgood Marshall's position, who was retiring. This way, they would keep the racial balance that they'd had on the court. But the NAACP, the Urban League, now all opposed the nomination. Why? Because of his alleged misconduct while at EEOC and criticism of the affirmative action. He was not a supporter of Roe v. Wade and supposed sexual harassment of a young lady called Anita Hill. And this is a picture of he and his wife. He divorced his first wife after 11 years and married this lady. There was a total of 54 organizations opposing. And just to give you a list, the AF, it should be AFL and the CIO. The American Federation of Teachers, the National Bar Association, the National Council of Jewish Women, the Great Panthers, NOW, and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But there were 76 groups that were for him. So we have hearings, and a lot of them were televised. And after all the hearings and all the testimony, the committee did not find sufficient evidence to corroborate the claims, and they sent the nomination on to the Senate, but without any recommendation. And he was voted in and approved, and Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas took his seat at the Supreme Court on October the 23rd, 1991. Oh, that's enough boring stuff. Let's do something fun. Writers and artists. We'd come to not only accept, but expect artistic talent from our black brothers and sisters. And of course, the most mentioned writer is a black woman named Toni Morrison, who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 for Beloved and the Nobel Prize in 1993 for the entire body of her work. I'll always be honest about it. Oprah Winfrey had a lot to do with it. Nobody ever heard of her, really, in the normal field of things until she was introduced on our program. Although, in all honesty, I was introduced to her when I was doing undergraduate work at Kentucky Wesleyan. If you're not familiar with the book, you might have seen the made-for-TV movie starring Oprah. But she was not the only widely known black author. Alex Haley. If you were not around to see the original TV production of his work, I think you'd probably see reruns on cable. And of course, then there's my very personal favorite, Maya Angelou, and her autobiographical writings. The first is, of course, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She was also the woman who recited a poem at Bill Clinton's inauguration in '92. I have seen her interviewed on several TV shows, and especially on Oprah, and to me, she is the epitome of a lady. She's soft-spoken. She sits very quietly in her chair with her knees together and her hands holding in her lap. She sits upright. She looks at you when she's talking to you. She's just, every ounce a lady with a capital L. One of her most famous works, or her poems, is I Am a Woman. And I had the distinct pleasure of being selected to read that in a college class. I thought I'd done a pretty damn good job. When I finished, the professor was silent, and my first thought was, gee, I did it so well, he's speechless. Because I'm a modest person, you know. And when he spoke, he told me that I'd read it like a white middle-class woman. Well, my response was, that's what I am. Then he reminded me it was written by a black woman about a black woman. And it took me a week to 10 days before I finally got it right under his tutelage. There's a difference in your carriage. There's a difference in the way you speak. Totally. Ernest J. Gaines wrote the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, which was also turned into a television series. Walter Mosley was a writer of fiction, the kind I love, mysteries. Terry McMillan was writing about the problems of the middle-class blacks, and E. Lynn Harris wrote about a very touchy subject, which we've briefly discussed before, homosexuality and bisexuality in the African-American community. And of course, poets, we've got to include Maya Angelou. And some of the names Nicky Giovanni. Now, that doesn't sound like an African American name. It sounds more Italian, but he was black. Yosef Komayaki. There again, the name is foreign, but they are black. And there really weren't as many poets as well known as there were writers. So what about the graphic arts, the painters and the sculptors and the architects? Well, very small in numbers, but those that did rise up did so because of their abilities, and they won awards for their work. The jazz continues to grow and be popular. The famous and greats of the first half of the 20th century, of course, are gone. So enter some new ones: Miles Davis, Cannonball Adderley, Quincy Jones, just to mention a few. Now, I have noticed that jazz or blues is not usually the choice of college students, especially in the Midwest. It seems to thrive on the 30s plus generation and all along the rivers and large cities. Why? You got me. Guess we are just too busy trying to keep our heads above water out here. But anyway, African American music, rhythm and blues, soul, gospel, and crossover were all used very successfully by the African American entertainer. And it's very, very difficult to pin down just some of the artists because the list is so long, but I'm going to bore you and name a few. James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Patti LaBelle, Smokey Robinson, and the groups like the Shirelles, the Supremes, the Temptations, and of course the unforgettable Jackson 5. And one I didn't put on my list is more recent. There is Prince, although I don't know what he's called these days. There's Boys II Men, Mahalia Jackson, Nat King Cole, Dionne Warwick, Diana Ross, Whitney Houston, Ray Charles, Stevie Wonder, and you could go on and on and on. And these people are not only good at what they do, they can cross over. They can do any kind of style of music that they want. So what about actors? Well, two of my favorites, of course, are Ossie Davis and his wife, Ruby Dee, who has passed. They were successful on the stage and television. And of course, there's a very peaceful, outspoken Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, who are also successful actors. Then there's Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy as successful comedians and film actors. And of course, Spike Lee, the very famous film director. Of course, you could go on and on with a list of successful black artists, too. Ones in films and television and stage. In the 21st century, it's just not unexpected. But some had a very hard row to hoe. Anyone does, especially if your skin is black. But there was basically some trends going on, and we'll come back to some more famous and popular artists in a minute. Like the Black Arts Movement. Those were some who insisted that the black art was a spiritual sister of the black revolutionary visions. But most of that group who sought to be superlative creative, and they were poets. Another trend basically was the black aesthetics, and they dealt with the appearances, the beautiful, and this group insisted that the black writer should be following a set of rules made for black writers and be judged as black writers, insisting that the values of the black writer were not the same as those found in the Western culture, or in other words, in Western white culture. In the third trend, the domination of the literary field with black women. And we credit this with the growing awareness that black women and men had an important role in society. And there really does seem to be more black women writing than black men. But in the area of graphic arts and sculpture, there seems to be a scarcity of African Americans. Well, there's a couple of reasons. Of course, opportunity and lack of desire. It's not an area where you could make a living, and no matter how good you are, if your work does not sell, you have to have a second job. And that can sometimes stem the creative flow. Also, there was a great deal of lack of encouragement from the white and the black community. And the classical field, whether it's racism is claimed by some African Americans or the lack of a sponsor and the time to mold your talent. It takes years and years to get to the top. Even if you've got a lot of talent, very few make it, white or black. It's easier nowadays in the time of instant communication, but to be successful, you need to be more than just a flash in the pan, a one-trick pony, one shot on the Oprah show. You have to have staying power and a backer with enough money to finance your long trip to the top. Now, the singers who are opera singers, they seem to fare somewhat better. I don't know if it's because of their roles being available for women of color. I really don't know. There are some other people named. It's not only in the movies that we know about them. That media called television. We see black entertainers day and night, 7 days a week. I mentioned some of them earlier, so I won't repeat that whole list. But compared to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, the African American was creative, diverse, but nowadays their talents spread over wide, different mediums. And here again, you cannot pigeonhole them. They would cross back and forth between one genre and another. What about BET, Black Entertainment Television? I saw a TV piece on him one day. It was on CBS Sunday morning, I think. The president of BET is a multi-millionaire. And when asked why he did this, why did he start this, he said he started the channel to showcase not only black entertainers, but to provide something that was truly for the African American community. And surprise, surprise, the project made money. So anyway, we now also have black newscasters and black reporters writing. And the one I think most well known there in Kentucky is Leonard Pitts Jr., who writes for the Miami Herald. He publishes at, he has his column once or sometimes twice a week. I think it's on Tuesdays. Personally, I think the man rocks. He's, as they say, right on. And I guess it's because of hard work, the black reporter finally gained success in a national audience. There's a lot of names that's going to be mentioned in the text, but the one, of course, we all know is Brian Gumbel, who was co-host of the Today Show for many years. I didn't like him. I thought he was an egotistical little fella. And he has a brother who is very personable and about 3 times the size of Brian, but I can't remember his name. And he's a sports commentator. And don't forget the talk shows. In the beginning, talk shows were all white and male. And then along came Oprah Winfrey. Well, rhetorical question. Why are talk shows so popular anyway? Some of them are good and informing, and some of them I think are just nothing but knockdown, drag-out fights. Of course, we all know and love Oprah, and I think we're all kind of sorry to see her go. And I didn't watch her every day. I usually checked to see what was on, and sometimes I would tape it. And then you got professional sports. And back in 1947, it was, of course, Jackie Robinson who broke the color barrier in baseball. And after that, blacks entered basketball and football and tennis. And, of course, Arthur Ashe, one of the most famous tennis players, because he died of AIDS. And boxing has long been a sport in which blacks have been successful for the longest time. Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, and, of course, the very controversial Muhammad Ali. And in track and field, African Americans have made many, many strides, women too. And if you look at the current women champions like Jackie Joyner-Kersee, they're all very well represented and respected. And what is that racist saying about white boys can't jump? And our own former governor, Happy Chandler, even got in trouble for saying that a lot. It's a racist statement. So let me ask you, are African American athletes better athletes than the white ones? And if so, why? Well, one of the reasons I think we see so many African American athletes, and they're doing so good, they work hard at it. It's a way to get out of whatever they're in, usually a poor neighborhood. It's a way to go to college that otherwise wouldn't be available. And I think they try a little bit harder because they have more to gain. Again, it's a way out. And that will make them work just a little bit harder. Now, chapter 23 is called Perspectives on the Present, but like I say, I'm only doing about part of this chapter and going to 2000. Now, Daniel Webster says the word stirring means a slight movement or changes of position. In the 1960s and the 1970s were not exactly quiet. There was big and small steps taken, so there were stirrings. And one of the stirrings being accomplished was about the manufacture, use, and distribution of drugs. And it didn't seem to matter whether you were black, white, yellow, or brown, you were involved. So to supposedly answer this problem, there was an Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1988 passed. A drug czar was appointed to oversee the operation of some 30 federal agencies. And the newly elected President Bush appointed a man named William J. Bennett to serve in that position. But going against advice to make that position a cabinet level one, it didn't happen. So most people felt that that position was really cosmetic more than a position, and he couldn't get anything done. The same arguments were used when President Bush created a position to coordinate intelligence information from various agencies after 9/11 and didn't give the director a position or the authority to control the funds. And we all know he who controls the funds controls the organization. And back to drugs. There was a lot of publicity against drug use, but for all the rhetoric, little got done. And even though claiming at the end of his term to have made progress, the use of drugs continued to climb, and the violence associated with the selling and use of drugs continues to climb. Now, Michael Williams was the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, a black man. He tried to stop what he was calling race-specific scholarships, stating they were discriminatory. Let's look at that just for a minute or two, because there's two sides to every story. You think he was wrong? We are a racist nation. And speaking from personal experience working in the public sector, there is discriminatory practices out there. Discriminatory. I personally believe the best way to improve yourself and improve yourself economically is through education. And having a certain amount of funds set aside for minority students is a way to afford access to people who otherwise could not get help. And here again, the scream of racial reverse discrimination is heard. Yeah, in some ways it's true, but until this world is colorblind, what is the other solution? You are young and smart. Come up with some answers. Another story is something called AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Sometimes I wonder how long it's been around. I think it was started in the 60s, if you want to know the truth. And we knew about it as early as 1981. And who was president then? Ronald Reagan, from 1981 through 1989. And there have been many, many discussions and articles about the lack of, for a better word, attention to the growing problem. But President Reagan was much more interested in defeating communism once and for all, and all foreign matters in general, than a health-based domestic issue that he didn't care about. And he was also convinced, as most of the general public was, that there was an epidemic among the gays and the lesbians. But it didn't take long before he had moved outside that segment of society to people who were heterosexual, who were not African American. And before you know it, it's being tied to drug use and dirty needles and sharing of needles. In 1986, the National Black, Gay, and Lesbian Conference was formed. It offered support and information for preventing the disease to the black community. It also tried to address the problems of prejudice against not only being black, but being black and gay. And while most of the white community and a very large portion of the black community continued to believe it was a homosexual disease, two respected, loved, and not gay men were reported to the media that they had been infected by HIV. And of course, we're talking about Magic Johnson and Arthur Ashe. Johnson, of course, is still alive, but Arthur Ashe had developed full-blown AIDS and died less than a year after his announcement. Which leads to a little bit of discussion the difference between HIV positive and having full-blown AIDS. HIV means you have it. Full-blown AIDS means you got it and you're going to die. Now, when President Bush became president, he was given a report urging him to take a stronger role in helping the general public become aware of the growing AIDS epidemic. The National Commission of AIDS pushed the president to ask Congress for money for medical research and treatment centers and to make a general awareness of the disease itself. Well, he listened, but he really didn't do anything else. He did call for an end to discrimination against those affected with AIDS. Well, why don't you just go spit in the wind? Oh, he did appoint Magic Johnson to the National Committee on AIDS, but there again, was it cosmetic or was it workable? Most Americans, black and white, still thought it was a sexually transmitted disease among homosexuals. And until you could clear that up and learn how it was transmitted from one to the other, there's going to be fear and there's going to be discrimination. Now, there was a charge made in 1992 accusing the government of providing inadequate financial support to prevent the spread of AIDS among Africans. those of African, Hispanic, Asian, and Native American ancestry, and the charge could, of course, be repeated, because that's where the majority of the problem was. So why was the spread of AIDS so prominent in those communities? Did it ever occur to you that it might have been lack of education? Lack of money to do anything about it? Well, Johnson resigned, claiming that Bush was only giving lip service to the program, nothing more. In other words, it was a cosmetic type of appointment to have a man that everybody knew and loved out there in the front. But at long last, people who were not affected by AIDS began to speak out, like Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife or widow. I threw in the name up there, Elizabeth Taylor, because she began to speak out against it too. And there were groups like religious groups, and the Congressional Black Caucus began to speak out. Because there's no way you could mask the truth. It was the worst health emergency to ever face our nation. And finally, we're going to talk out loud about it. And it becomes a notion of morality. Black leaders, religious, white leaders, religious, were urged to stop judging AIDS as God's curse on the wicked. And it's amazing how even today, in the 21st century, many still see AIDS as a punishment from God. 1 in 50 African Americans is infected. And Africans only constitute 43% of all those infected, yes, but that's a pretty high percentage. But the African American population is only 12% of the total population. It was not going to be until 1998 that a major offensive was begun to learn what's going on and try to stem the tide of the growing effects of AIDS in the Black and Latino communities. But even in the final years of the 20th century, a lot of Black churches and clergy, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't really want to address the sexual issues related to it. And I personally think that's been a large part of the problem. Because sex, anything related to sex, it's a very volatile issue at home, in schools, and in public. Education, condoms, abstinence, it's a no-win situation. And I wish we had the time or the method to even get into what's happening to certain countries in Africa with AIDS because of lack of education, public health, and governments not even admitting that there is a problem. We have entire communities infested, and they're not homosexual. The dad has it, he gives it to the mother gives it to the unborn child, and there you go. There are new drugs on the market that will help HIV, but once it becomes full-blown AIDS, there isn't any help. Let's talk about music for a minute. Now, I've been told there's a difference between hip-hop and rap. But as a member of the older generation, I have never really understood rap. And when I could understand the words of rap, I was usually horrified at what was being said. And why did it come about? It came about, I know, as a reflection of the poverty and the violence and the lack of education, the frustration and the rage. And the actions of the performers did nothing to make it more acceptable. I used to think, this too will pass. But until the situation that caused the rise of the phenomena is cured, it's not going to go away. And contrary to my public condemnation of rap, I do believe it's important for youth of each generation to have their own culture. We had our culture in the 50s, or I did. And of course, you, being younger, you had a different type of music. But I grew up with rock and roll, the earliest form of it. And it was usually about love lost, love never had, love betrayed. Back, I told one of my American history students about the only time we'd had any violence in any of our songs back in those days when Grandma got run over by a reindeer. Afrocentrism is basically an outlook of the world viewed from Africa. Africa is going to be the center of it. When you say that all good things came from Africa, or the descendants of the African people. And it usually includes a revisionist history that recasts the world history from the African point of view. As example, Aristotle the Greek stole his philosophies from Egypt. Yeah. And that both Socrates and Cleopatra were black. There's also a claim that the Egyptians had invaded Greece. No. We were taught that Greece invaded Egypt. So maybe it's the other way around. In a more radical form, it's also usually connected with black supremacy, which includes the notion that African contributions to world history, culture, and race are superior to the contributions of peoples from any other continent. So how did all this get started? Well, there's a lot of different cultures, even on the continent of Africa, and many different shades of skin color, as well as different languages. My personal view is that it really began back in the 18th and 19th century, brought on by the European imperialism and racism. And it continued in the United States as a way to instill black pride in the 20th century. But the radical Afrocentrists were racist and violently anti-Semitic. They even state that the scholarly debates are continuing over the issue, and I think it was last year sometime on the Discovery of the History Channel, I don't remember which, they had a program about a black Cleopatra, and I've heard most of the arguments. Then we have racial profiling. It's a very touchy issue. A black man driving in the wrong neighborhood or driving an expensive car could be pulled over simply because he was black. Now, I think that's wrong, and I'm sure most of you do too. But if a black man holds up a store and you have to describe the man you're looking for as, well, he's male and 5'2", you're never going to find him. But if you describe him as being black, then any black man answering that description anywhere in the area is going to be stopped. I personally know some African Americans that have been questioned for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I know what it's like to have a long-haired young man be pulled over simply because of his long hair and his hippie car. So I had a teenager during the 70s with long hair, and he was continually being pulled over and searched. Did I get mad? Sure. Did I do anything other than complain and ask my son to get a haircut? No. We don't have the time to go into what my life was like with 5 sons during the 1970s and 80s. Believe me, it was a trip. And as I said, there have been numerous instances where an innocent black man was killed because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or when he was arrested, he wasn't exactly treated with dignity. Now, there were some major setbacks in the attempt to seek racial equality, and there was also some giant steps forward. And one of the best ones and most important ones was the growing middle class of black African Americans in every field, private and professional. And the beginning of this growth, most of those people stayed or worked in the black communities. By the middle of the 20th century, I guess you could call crossover. The word I prefer really is acceptance. And they're moving out into other parts of the area and community. And by the end of the century, coming into the 21st century, there's nothing unusual to see a middle class or even wealthy black man or woman. There's always been a few African Americans who possessed wealth, and by the 1950s, their numbers were beginning to grow as well as their influence. Economic strength. Now, it was economic strength and pulling together that ended the bus boycotts. But in the entertainment and sports fields, it's become quite acceptable to see a black man or woman earning millions of dollars for playing sports or endorsing a product. And your text probably will mention Michael Jordan, Sammy Sosa, and Tiger Woods from 3 different fields: basketball, baseball, and golf. I'm not going to spend time telling you what you already know about these men. But after 12 years of Republican rule under Reagan and Bush, the African American community was watching very closely this 1992 congressional and presidential election. And there were 2 Democrats, one from Arkansas and one from Tennessee. You got Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And they seemed to show an interest in issues that Bush and Reagan had ignored. And when the former campaign manager for Jesse Jackson, Ron Brown, started working for Clinton, the black community sat up and took notice of this Southerner. They're ready for a change. And quite honestly, so were a lot of white Democrats. It's surprising the large number of African Americans in this country, and only 8% of the voter turnout in that election was black. But of that 8%, the majority did vote Democratic. Of course, the fact that there were also blacks on the ballot and running for office might have hit some of you, I don't know, but many people would vote straight ticket. I don't happen to, and I hope you don't either. But one African-American woman, Carol Moseley Braun of Illinois, was elected to the United States Senate, and there were 16 other African-Americans that got seats in the House of Representatives. So now we got 39. And some of them had positions on committees that were really important. Bill Clinton had said during his campaign he wanted his administration to look like American. Of course, what this meant was open to interpretation, but the black community was hopeful and watching. Vernon Johnson was appointed as the chairman of the transition team, and at his inauguration, Maya Angelou read a poem. And now you know the reason for the title of this section. It was the title of the poem Miss Angelou read, called On the Pulse of the Morning. That's stirring. President Clinton also appointed 8 African Americans to very important posts and numerous to undersecretary posts. And no, I don't expect you to know them all, but there's 3 I want you to remember. Mike Epstein, Secretary of Agriculture. Jacqueline Elders as a Surgeon General of the United States, and Terrence Duvernay as a Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And to the black community, this was a large, big, giant step, because no other president had ever had so many African Americans in important positions. 1994. Something happened that surprised me personally, and I think a lot of the nation, because the Republicans took control of the Congress. Now, African Americans stayed behind Clinton, even when he sided with the Republicans on the attempt to remove welfare recipients off of assistance and to work programs. But the appointees that he had made that came under attack, I don't believe they were attacked because they were black. I think they were attacked because they were supporters of Clinton. For instance, Ron Brown, Secretary of Commerce, was accused of involvement with an Asian business. I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't died. Mike Epstein, Secretary of Agriculture, was investigated, indicted, and tried, and acquitted. And Clinton stood by his appointees, but the one he had to give in on was Dr. Elders. She made some very outspoken remarks indiscreetly, and he had to fire her or request her resignation. Jocelyn Elders. She was born Minnie Jones on August the 13th, 1933 in the farming community of a little bitty town in Arkansas. She took the name of Jocelyn in college. But she had lived in a very poor, segregated area, and she had 7 siblings. She worked in the cotton fields and attended an all-black school 13 miles from home. In home was a 3-room cabin that lacked an indoor toilet and electricity, so this girl knew what it's like to be poor. She was confirmed as the 16th Surgeon General of the United States, and the first African American and the second female to head that. During her 15 months as Surgeon General, Elders added tobacco use, national health care, and drug and alcohol abuse to her list of major concerns. See, when she was back in Arkansas, she campaigned for the clinics and expanded sex education throughout her state. And she battled the conservatives very much who were criticizing her efforts. Some feared that the distribution of condoms would increase sexual activity and promote abortion. But she continued her work regarding teen pregnancy, and she was concerned with tobacco use, national health care, and as I said, not only immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, gun control, and drug and alcohol abuse. But she was making a statement to the National Health Day at the United Nations about ways to prevent AIDS, and when asked if what they thought was one of them, she stated masturbation is something that is part of human sexuality and part of something that should be taught. Whoa! Say there was a storm of protest, is putting it mildly. Clinton was forced to ask for her resignation, and then she returned to Arkansas and practiced medicine and taught sex education until, oh gosh, I guess it was just a couple of years ago she retired, but she's still making speeches all over the place. So during the 1990s, there's more and more black politicians. There were black mayors in Houston, San Francisco, Savannah, Jackson, Mississippi, Denver, and Stone Mountain. And some very, very wise men, black and white, began to work to end racism in their cities. Even in the communities that did not have black political leadership, the public attended city councils and school board meetings. And I guess I forgot to check this slide. I apologize. So things are changing. That takes us up pretty much to 2000 in the election of another Republican, another George Bush. And I'm not going there. But I do want to mention Condoleezza Rice, President Bush's national advisor during his first term. A very prestigious job for anyone, especially a black woman. Now this pretty much concludes our trip through black history. I sincerely hope that you've learned things that you did not know before. And I've given you some things to think about. And I hope you now realize just how much the black men and women have contributed to our country and society. Education is always an answer as far as I'm concerned. So now you have some education about African Americans. When you see someone, don't look at the color of their skin. See them as a person, an American. Now I'll get off my soapbox and say thank you for listening.